We are witnessing one of the most extraordinary moments in modern economic history. What is happening between the United States and China right now is not simply another trade negotiation. It is a complete redefinition of the global economic order. And when we analyze the details of these recent agreements, when we examine what is really happening behind the headlines, what we find is something truly astonishing. Let us begin with what just occurred on October 30th, 2025 in South Korea. President Trump and President Xi Jinping met and reached what the White House has called a historic agreement. But we need to understand exactly what this means from an economic perspective. China, which for years has been building its economic power precisely by controlling critical minerals, just made concessions that even a few months ago would have been unthinkable. Let us talk about rare earth elements. These are not ordinary minerals. These are the essential components of all our modern technology. We are talking about materials that are absolutely critical for manufacturing smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, defense systems. China controls 94% of global production of permanent magnets containing rare earths. 94%. To put this in perspective, 2 decades ago, China controlled around 50%. They have doubled their market share in 20 years. And here is what is truly critical. In April of 2025, China imposed export controls on 7 rare earth elements. Prices in Europe reached up to 6 times the prices in China. 6 times. This is economic power in its purest form. Then in October, China expanded these controls and implemented what is called extraterritorial jurisdiction, requiring licenses for products manufactured anywhere in the world that contain Chinese materials. But then something extraordinary happened. At the South Korea meeting, China agreed to suspend the global implementation of these expansive controls. They agreed to issue general licenses valid for exports of rare earths, gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite for the benefit of United States end users. This is effectively the de facto elimination of controls that China imposed since 2023. Now, why is this so significant? Because it represents a fundamental shift in China's economic strategy. For years, China has been building its dominance in critical minerals as a tool of geopolitical influence. The International Energy Agency has been warning about the risks of this supply concentration. For 19 of 20 important strategic minerals, China is the leading refiner with an average market share of 70%. But here is the problem from China's perspective. Every time they use these export restrictions, they accelerate diversification efforts in the rest of the world. After China imposed restrictions, previously dormant rare earth projects suddenly became attractive to long-term investors. So from a game theory perspective, China faced a choice. They could maintain the restrictions and accelerate the loss of their long-term market dominance, or they could back down, maintain cooperative international relationships, and preserve their dominant market position. They chose to back down. That is what makes this agreement so significant. Now, let us talk about the other major component of this agreement, fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is up to 50 times stronger than heroin. Since 2016, fentanyl has been the drug most frequently associated with overdose deaths in the United States. The annual death toll is still nearly at the level of United States casualties for the entire Vietnam War. The problem has been that chemical companies based in China have been advertising and selling online fentanyl precursor chemicals, including some that are not internationally controlled and that consequently are legal to export outside China. These companies ship these items to Mexico or directly to the United States. The customers, often associated with transnational criminal organizations based in Mexico, pay for the chemicals in cryptocurrency, making it difficult to trace the money. Now, as part of this October 2025 agreement, China committed to stop the flow of precursors used to manufacture fentanyl to the United States. FBI Director Kash Patel revealed that China has designated and fully listed the 13 precursors used to manufacture fentanyl and agreed to control 7 chemical subsidiaries. But here is the economic reality. Even if China robustly complies with its commitment, deaths may not decline immediately. Mexican cartels have stockpiles of precursors and can obtain them from other sources. The bigger problem is designer precursors, chemicals created specifically for drug production that are not regulated. So why is the fentanyl agreement economically important? Because it represents a shift in diplomatic priorities. For years, China has been frustrated by congressional criticism over its role in the fentanyl crisis. They have argued that they have already taken extensive measures to regulate precursor chemicals, but the agreement showed they were willing to make additional concessions as part of a broader economic package. And here is where the real economics of the agreement comes in. And in exchange for these commitments from China, the United States reduced tariffs on Chinese imports. The United States reduced fentanyl-related tariffs by 10 percentage points from the cumulative rate effective November 10th, 2025. It will maintain its suspension of elevated reciprocal tariffs on Chinese imports until November 10th, 2026. The current 10% reciprocal tariff will remain in effect during this suspension period. Now, some will say that reducing tariffs from 20 to 10% still leaves overall tariffs on Chinese products at around 47%, down from 57%. That is still high. But from an economic perspective, what matters is the direction of change and what it signals about future negotiations. Tariffs on China have been associated with higher prices and slower growth in the United States. Their partial elimination should have a beneficial impact. At the margin, the tariff cut should also contribute to continued industrial activity by providing United States manufacturers with more competitive access to intermediate imports. Now, let us talk about the third major component of this agreement, agriculture, specifically soybeans. Soybeans contribute more than $31 billion to the United States economy. In 2024, China purchased more than half of all United States soybean exports, totaling $12.6 billion. But in response to Trump's tariffs, China stopped all United States soybean purchases since May. Chinese tariffs now make United States soybeans 20% more expensive than South American exports. This has led China to turn to other major soybean exporters, including producers in Argentina and Brazil, which comes at the direct expense of United States farmers. China imported 71% of its soybeans from Brazil in 2024, compared to 2% in the late 1990s. As part of the South Korea agreement, China committed to purchase at least 12 million metric tons of United States soybeans during the last 2 months of 2025 and purchase at least 25 million metric tons annually in 2026, 2027, and 2028. These are significant numbers. For context, China purchased nearly 27 million metric tons in 2024. But here is the economic reality we need to face. As of mid-November, China had only purchased 332,000 metric tons of United States soybeans since the summit in South Korea. That is far below the 12 million metric tons that the Agriculture Secretary said China agreed to purchase by January. Why? Because China has a soybean surplus. They have imported so much supply from South America that they have excess soybeans. Despite the surplus, private importers are still booking soybean shipments from Brazil for next month. The Chinese tariff on United States beans remains high at around 24%, despite a 10 percentage point reduction after the summit. Soybean prices fell sharply 23 cents to $11.24 per bushel after the Agriculture Department data was published showing the lack of Chinese demand. Economists said that is the market getting hit by the lack of Chinese demand. Now, some soybean farmers are saying they may not be able to survive a prolonged trade dispute with China. The president of the American Soybean Association said during a congressional hearing in October that agricultural production costs, including land, seed, and fertilizer costs, have skyrocketed while farming margins continue to fall. For soybean farmers, The loss of the largest export market due to China's trade retaliation has worsened financial problems. High production costs and significant market losses mean soybean farmers are expected to face a loss of around $109 per acre for this year's harvest. Almost all crops being planted in 2025 show no profit on paper. The cushion they had in 2018 and 2019 is no longer there, and the margin of error and risk they are facing as they enter this 2025 growing season is more extreme than back then. So what does all this tell us from an economic perspective? It tells us we are in the midst of a fundamental recalibration of global economic relationships. The agreement between the United States and China in October 2025 is not just about tariffs or soybeans or minerals. It is about the balance of economic power in the 21st century. China made significant concessions on critical minerals because they calculated that preserving long-term market dominance was more important than exerting short-term pressure. They made concessions on fentanyl precursors as part of a broader diplomatic package. They committed to purchasing United States soybeans, although actual implementation has been slow. On the United States side, Trump reduced tariffs but maintained a baseline stance. He signaled a willingness for further reduction but not capitulation. He is playing what game theorists would call a mixed strategy, conditional cooperation with credible threats of escalation. Now, let us talk about what is happening in the Senate, because this is directly related to the broader economic dynamics we just discussed. And this is where things get really interesting from a political economy perspective. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is facing growing calls to step aside after 7 Democrats broke ranks with the party to vote for a Republican-led proposal to end the government shutdown without receiving concessions on extending Affordable Care Act subsidies. Now, let us talk economics here. The Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies have helped 24 million Americans afford health insurance, with 92% receiving premium assistance. These subsidies are scheduled to expire at the end of 2025. Without them, premiums are expected to more than double on average, a 114% increase from $888 annually in 2025 to $1,904 in 2026. Think about what this means economically. We are talking about 24 million people who will suddenly face health insurance premiums that are more than double. For many, this will mean they can no longer afford health insurance. They will become uninsured again. This has cascading effects throughout the economy. Uncompensated healthcare costs that get passed on to hospitals, people who avoid preventive care and end up in emergency rooms with more costly conditions, loss of labor, productivity. But here is the political and economic dynamic. The measure approved by the Senate funds parts of the government until January 30th, but excludes Affordable Care Act health insurance subsidies that benefit some 24 million Americans. Progressive Democrats blame Schumer for allowing centrist Democrats to strike a deal with Senate Republicans. Representative Ro stated, "Schumer is no longer effective and should be replaced." This is an extraordinarily harsh criticism from a member of the same party, but it reflects a fundamental tension in United States political economy right now. Here is the economic reality. The United States is facing significant fiscal pressures. The government shutdown itself has economic costs, federal employees not getting paid, contracts being delayed, uncertainty affecting business investment, but extending Affordable Care Act subsidies also has fiscal costs. These are federally funded subsidies that cost tens of billions of dollars per year. So the centrist Democrats who voted to end the government shutdown without extending Affordable Care Act subsidies were making a calculation. They believed it was more important to end the government shutdown immediately than to hold the line on health subsidies. Progressive Democrats made a different calculation. They believed that abandoning 24 million Americans who could lose affordable health insurance was unacceptable. This is not just a disagreement about tactics. It is a fundamental disagreement about economic priorities. And it is a reflection of broader tensions in the Democratic Party about how to balance fiscal discipline with social welfare priorities. Now let us connect this back to the China situation. Because here is the thing. The economic policy choices the United States is making domestically affect its ability to compete with China internationally. If the United States is divided internally about spending priorities, if it is facing government shutdowns, if it cannot pass legislation to support key industries, that weakens its bargaining position with China. And this is where Elon Musk comes in. Elon Musk led the Department of Government Efficiency after it was created on January 20th, 2025 by President Trump's executive order, with the goal of modernizing federal technology, cutting wasteful expenditures, and restructuring federal agencies. The idea was simple: bring private sector mentality to the federal government, cut bureaucracy, eliminate waste, make government run more like an efficient business. Musk initially promised to cut $2 trillion in federal spending. But here is the economic reality. Musk left the Department of Government Efficiency at the end of May 2025. The department continues under acting administrator Amy Gleason, but it has not met Musk's initial promise to cut $2 trillion in federal spending. Even the $180 billion it claimed to save has been dogged by inaccuracies and overstatements. Why? Because it turns out that making government efficient is really hard. It is not like running a private company. There are legal constraints, contractual obligations, congressional mandates. You cannot just fire people or cancel programs the way you can in the private sector. And here is the political tension. Musk and Trump had a public feud from June to September of 2025 after Musk criticized Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, but they reconciled at Charlie Kirk's memorial service in September, and Musk recently attended a White House dinner with Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in November. So what does all this tell us? It tells us we are in a moment of extraordinary volatility and uncertainty in global political economy. The old rules are being rewritten, the old alliances are being rethought, the old assumptions are being challenged. China, which for years built its economic power on controlling critical minerals, is now making concessions because they calculate that preserving long-term market dominance is more important than short-term pressure. The United States, which for years operated under free trade principles, is now using tariffs and export controls as foreign policy tools. The Democratic Party, which for years united around expanding health benefits, is now divided over whether to prioritize fiscal discipline or health protections. And through all of this, 24 million Americans are waiting to see if their health insurance premiums will double. Soybean farmers are waiting to see if China will actually buy their crops. Manufacturers are waiting to see if they can get the rare earth minerals they need for their products. Economic theory tells us that markets adapt, that prices adjust, that new equilibria are found. But economic theory also tells us that transitions can be painful, that adjustments take time, that real people suffer during periods of disruption, and that is what we are living through now, a period of massive disruption in the global economic order. The outcome will determine the balance of economic power for decades to come. It will determine which countries control the industries of the future. It will determine whether millions of people can afford health insurance or keep their farms or find work in manufacturing. These are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are decisions that affect real lives. And that is why we need to pay attention. That is why we need to understand the economic forces at play. That is why we need to demand that our political leaders make decisions based not just on short-term political considerations, but on long-term economic realities. The agreement between the United States and China in October 2025 will be remembered as a pivotal moment, but it was just one step in a much longer process of global economic rebalancing. The next steps will determine whether this rebalancing happens in an orderly or chaotic manner, whether it creates opportunities or crises, whether it leads to prosperity or conflict, and we all have a stake in making sure it goes in the right direction.